Hello, I'd like to talk today about the Second Amendment. And many people are familiar with the Second Amendment and the controversies that come along with it. And the two main controversies that come along with the Second Amendment, obviously number one, in more recent days with the tragic mass shootings that have taken place in our country, there's a debate on what kind of gun law should be in place and how strict that they should be. But there's also controversy that lies within the interpretation of the Second Amendment and who actually does it apply to. The ConstitutionCenter.org states that the Second Amendment reads as following: "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." And where the controversy comes in is some people believe that the Second Amendment is within the context of the state militia. The right to keep and bear arms, people believe, refers to the state militia. On the other side, though, you have people that believe that the right to keep and bear arms is actually referring to individuals' right to keep and bear arms. You do have to understand the context of the Constitution. The states were coming off the Articles of Confederation. And part of the hesitancy and the concern they had with the Constitution is that the state's power was going to be infringed and curbed upon to the point where the federal government was going to grow all-powerful. And so with the Bill of Rights, I believe that the federal government was trying to reassure states that they would still have power. And I think that the Second Amendment was addressing that concern and showing them that they did have the power to raise and keep a state militia. But to say that they totally were not referring at all to individuals' right to keep and bear arms with the Second Amendment, I think is a stretch also. Now, according to PreventGunViolence.org, there are two big Supreme Court cases that dealt with this issue. The first one was in 1939, the United States versus Miller. This case said that the obvious purpose of the Second Amendment was to assure the continuation and render possible the effectiveness of state militias. So essentially, it said that, yes, the Second Amendment was in context and referring to state militias and not individuals' rights to keep and bear arms. But more recently, in 2008, you had the District of Columbia versus Heller. That Supreme Court case actually said the opposite and said, no, the Second Amendment was referring to individuals' right to keep and bear arms. Furthermore, it stated that DC's restriction of handguns was, in fact, unconstitutional. And it did make an important point also. The Supreme Court stated that it was the federal government's power and responsibility to limit and restrict the sale of firearms, ammunition, and other parts of guns. And there has been controversy on whose power is that to regulate the sale of firearms and to enforce gun law, states or the federal government. And more increasingly, with the Supreme Court cases that have come up recently, the power has shifted to the federal government's responsibility. Now, according to the Washington Post, another very important gun law that kind of set the groundwork for the laws that we have today in America was the Gun Control Act of 1968. And it was primarily a federal law, and it was in response to the assassinations of JFK and Robert Kennedy. And the main things that this gun control law said is, number one, it prohibited convicted felons and mentally ill from purchasing firearms. It increased the age to 21 of the ages when you can purchase a firearm, and it expanded the licensing requirements needed to purchase a firearm. And obviously the controversy that comes along these days is the question of what kind of guns should be restricted, who has the power to enforce these gun laws, and things of that nature. And as of today, the only firearm that the federal government has limited and restricted is fully automatic weapons, and you cannot purchase those unless you have a Class 3 firearms license. So the two main controversies that come along with the Second Amendment are, number one, the enforcement of that, how strict it should be, who should be enforcing it, but then number two, just the interpretation of the amendment and who actually was that Second Amendment referring to. Thank you.